You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 6,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's dive into today's story. The windshield wipers of David Klein's pickup truck fought a losing battle against the driving snow as he navigated the winding mountain road toward Bromach Hollow, Alaska. Each gust of Arctic wind threatened to send his vehicle sliding off the narrow asphalt into the black void below, where jagged rocks waited like broken teeth. The GPS had lost signal 40 miles back, leaving him to follow hand-drawn directions copied from his grandfather's journal. Directions that led to a place most people believed didn't exist. David had been driving for 3 days straight, stopping only for gas and brief naps in truck stops where fluorescent lights hummed like dying insects. The urgency in his grandfather's final letter still burned in his mind like a brand. If something happens to me, David, you must go to Bromach Hollow. The things I helped bury there in 1943 are stirring again. The transmissions have started. Find Dr. Thorne's research. Finish what we started before they finish us all. His grandfather, Colonel William Klein, had died under circumstances that defied explanation 2 weeks ago. The official cause was listed as cardiac arrest, but the old man had been in perfect health, a 93-year-old who still chopped his own firewood and hiked 10 miles every morning. More disturbing were the circumstances of his death. He'd been found in his study at 3:17 a.m., surrounded by scattered papers and radio equipment, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The coroner noted that his hair had turned completely white, though it had been salt and pepper grey just days before. The local police dismissed it as the unfortunate death of an elderly man, but David knew better. His grandfather had been terrified of something specific, something that had driven him to barricade his windows and install motion sensors around his property. The old soldier who had survived Normandy and Korea had spent his final weeks living like a man under siege. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. when David finally spotted Bromach Hollow's welcome sign through the swirling snow. The wooden post leaned at a drunken angle, riddled with bullet holes that formed a constellation of violence across its weathered surface. Population 47, founded 1896, the sign proclaimed in paint so faded it was barely legible. Below it, someone had spray-painted "Turn Back" in letters that dripped like dried blood, and beneath that, in smaller text that made David's skin crawl, "They're still hungry." Bromach Hollow stretched before him like a monument to abandonment and something far worse. The main street ran straight through the heart of town, flanked by buildings that seemed to mock human proportions with their impossible architecture. Every structure had been built wrong. Door frames that stretched nearly 15 feet high, windows positioned too far above ground level, and roof lines that disappeared into the darkness overhead like the ribs of some massive skeleton. Street lamps flickered sporadically along the empty road, casting twisted shadows that moved independently of their sources, creating an optical illusion that made David's eyes water. The few vehicles visible had been stripped to their frames, metal skeletons picked clean by time and scavengers, their doors hanging open like screaming mouths. Snow drifted through broken windows and open doorways, nature slowly reclaiming what humanity had abandoned in desperate haste. David parked outside what had once been Murphy's Diner, according to a neon sign that hung by a single chain, swaying in the wind, with a rhythmic creaking that sounded almost like breathing. The building's windows were boarded with planks that looked like they'd been ripped from shipping crates, each piece marked with strange scratches that might have been claw marks, if claws could grow to the size of railroad spikes. Stepping out into the bitter cold, David's breath formed clouds that dissipated quickly in the wind, as if the very air was hungry for warmth. The silence was absolute and unnatural. No animal sounds, no wind through trees, no distant hum of civilization. Even for an abandoned town, the quiet felt wrong, like the held breath of something waiting to pounce. From the truck bed, David retrieved the equipment he'd assembled during his journey north, gear that had cost him his life savings and called in favors from old military contacts. Night vision scopes originally designed for special forces operations, radio receivers modified to detect ultra-low frequencies that officially didn't exist, seismic sensors capable of registering movement through solid bedrock, and cameras equipped with infrared capabilities that could see heat signatures through walls. His grandfather's journal had been specific about the need for documentation. "They've hidden the truth for 80 years, the old man had written in his final entry. "Someone needs to record what really happened here, what we really found in those tunnels. The world deserves to know what's coming back." Setting up his base of operations in the truck cab, David began the delicate process of calibrating his equipment. The radio system was his grandfather's own design, built from components that shouldn't have been available to civilians. As the system came online, static filled the cab, punctuated by strange pulses that seemed almost rhythmic, like the beating of an enormous heart. Then, cutting through the white noise like a knife through flesh, came a transmission that made David's blood freeze in his veins. It wasn't quite language, more like the echo of words spoken in a dialect that predated recorded human history. The sound seemed to vibrate through the truck's metal frame, and for a moment David felt something ancient and impossibly hungry, reaching across the airwaves, testing the boundaries of distance and time. He recorded everything, just as his grandfather had taught him during those long summer evenings, when David thought the old man was simply telling war stories. Whatever was broadcasting from the heart of Bromach Hollow had been doing so for decades, possibly longer. The question was whether anyone else was listening, and what they planned to do about it. Dawn broke over the mountains like a wound in the sky, painting the abandoned streets in shades of ash and bone that made the town look like a photograph from a war zone. David had managed only 2 hours of fitful sleep before the cold drove him from the truck. His dreams filled with shadows that moved wrong, and voices that spoke in tongues of stone and ice. His breath steamed in the frigid air as he began his systematic exploration of the town, each footstep echoing off empty buildings like gunshots in a cathedral. The first house he entered belonged to someone named Peterson, according to a mailbox that had toppled into the snow, its metal surface pocked with what looked like bite marks from teeth the size of railroad spikes. The front door had been left ajar, hanging on hinges that screamed in protest when David pushed it open. The sound echoed through the empty rooms like a warning, and somewhere deep in the house something creaked in response. Probably just settling wood, but David's hand instinctively moved to the pistol holstered at his hip. Inside, the evidence of the town's impossible nature became undeniable and deeply unsettling. The kitchen table stood 8 feet tall, its surface scarred with gouges too deep and precise for normal utensils. These weren't random scratches, but deliberate markings, as if someone had been carving messages into the wood, with tools designed for hands far larger than any human possessed. Chairs that would dwarf a professional basketball player were arranged around the dining area, their seats worn smooth by use, the wood polished to a shine that spoke of decades of occupation. The cushions, where they survived, showed impressions that suggested weights exceeding 500 pounds. Light fixtures hung 20 feet overhead, far beyond the reach of any normal person, their bulbs long since shattered and their wiring chewed through by something with very large, very sharp teeth. Most disturbing was the silverware scattered across the floor like the aftermath of a violent struggle. Each piece was massive enough to serve as a weapon, Forks with tines like railroad spikes that could punch through a man's chest, knives heavy enough to leave bone, spoons that could hold a gallon of liquid. David picked up what had once been a butter knife and nearly dropped it. The thing weighed at least 5 pounds and felt more like a machete than a dining utensil. The blade was stained with something dark that might have been rust, but when David scraped at it with his fingernail, flakes came away that looked disturbingly like dried blood. In the living room, David found furniture built on the same impossible scale, but here the signs of struggle were more obvious. A rocking chair that could seat 3 people had been overturned and partially crushed, as if something enormous had stepped on it during a fight. The fireplace was large enough to roast an entire pig, and indeed David found charred bones scattered among the ashes, bones that were far too large to have come from any normal animal. The walls were covered with family photographs in frames that hung 12 feet off the ground, as if displayed for viewers of enormous height. David climbed onto the overturned chair to examine them more closely and felt his stomach drop. The photos showed what appeared to be a normal family: mother, father, 3 children, but the proportions were all wrong. The adults stood at least 10 feet tall, with elongated limbs and faces that seemed stretched beyond human norms. The children, if they could be called that, were the size of adult basketball players but possessed the soft features of youth. Most disturbing was the final photo in the sequence, dated 1943. It showed the family standing beside a group of men in military uniforms, including one face David recognized from old family albums, his grandfather, looking exactly as he had in his 20s. Behind them loomed something that made David's hands shake as he held the camera, a figure so tall it had to crouch to fit in the frame, its features obscured by shadow but its size undeniably inhuman. House after house told variations of the same impossible story. Bromach Hollow had been built for occupants of gigantic proportions, beings who existed far beyond the normal range of human genetics. David documented everything with his camera, knowing that even video evidence would be dismissed as an elaborate hoax by anyone who hadn't seen this place with their own eyes. But as he moved through the abandoned homes, David began to notice details that suggested the town's abandonment hadn't been voluntary. Doors hung off their hinges, torn away from the inside, as if the occupants had been trying to escape something that had gotten inside with them. Windows were shattered outward, glass scattered on the ground in patterns that suggested explosive force. Drag marks scored the floors of several houses, leading from bedrooms towards the back doors in long parallel gouges that spoke of desperate struggles. In one house, David found a child's bedroom that made his throat tighten with emotion. The bed was enormous, built for a child the size of an adult, but the room was decorated with toys and pictures that spoke of innocence and youth. A teddy bear the size of a man sat in the corner, its button eyes reflecting David's flashlight beam like stars. But the bear had been torn open, its stuffing scattered across the floor, and its fabric was stained with dark patches that might have been blood. The town hall provided the first concrete clues to Bromach Hollow's dark history, though getting inside required David to climb through a window since the front doors had been torn completely away. The building's interior was a chaos of overturned furniture and scattered documents, as if someone had been searching desperately for something in the moments before evacuation. David spent hours sorting through the papers, piecing together a timeline that stretched back to the town's founding and revealed a truth more disturbing than he'd imagined. The earliest records, dating to 1896, described the discovery of what prospectors called the Deep Mine, a shaft that descended far into the mountain's heart and contained something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. A report filed by territorial governor officials described the mine's contents in clinical terms that barely concealed their horror. Human remains of unusual proportions have been recovered from the lower chambers. Preliminary measurements indicate adult specimens exceeding 12 feet in length, with bone structure suggesting advanced age, possibly several centuries. Cranial capacity appears to be roughly twice that of baseline human norms. Recommend immediate cessation of mining operations pending further investigation. Handwritten notes in the margins told a very different story, one that spoke of terror and disbelief. A prospector named Jeremiah Walsh had scrawled in increasingly frantic handwriting, "They ain't remains, God help us. Found them sleeping down there like they'd been waiting for something since the world was young. When our lanterns woke them, their eyes opened and looked right through us. Sarah's gone. Tom's gone. Whatever's down there, it's got a taste for human flesh, and it's been hungry for a very long time." More recent documents painted an even darker picture that connected directly to David's family history. Government correspondence from the 1940s referenced Project Nimrod and specimens of strategic interest, with David's grandfather's name appearing on numerous requisition forms and status reports. The project had apparently involved the relocation of surviving giant families to secret northern research facilities, where their unusual genetics could be studied and potentially weaponized for the war effort. One memo, stamped with security classifications that had long since expired, provided crucial details that made David's hands shake as he read, "Relocation of surviving Bromach Hollow population to Northern Research Station, Omega, proceeding as planned. Subjects demonstrate remarkable longevity, apparent immunity to conventional diseases, and adaptation to harsh environments that exceed human norms by several orders of magnitude. Most significantly, specimens show evidence of accelerated healing and tissue regeneration that could revolutionize battlefield medicine. Potential military applications under investigation. Note: subjects have become increasingly agitated since removal from their traditional territory. Recommend enhanced security measures." A later document, dated just weeks before the project's apparent termination, carried a tone of barely controlled panic. "Containment breach at Northern Station Omega. 17 personnel confirmed dead. An additional 12 missing and presumed consumed. Subjects have demonstrated coordinated intelligence and tactical planning far exceeding initial assessments. They are not animals to be studied. They are apex predators with centuries of experience hunting human prey. Recommend immediate termination of Project Nimrod and permanent sealing of all research facilities." The final document in the file was a termination order signed by David's grandfather and 3 other military officials. All research materials to be classified at the highest levels. Surviving specimens to be relocated to permanent containment in their territory of origin. Official records to reflect total loss of Bromach Hollow population due to epidemic disease. This matter is never to be discussed or investigated further. David photographed every page, understanding now why his grandfather had carried the burden of this knowledge for so many years. The giants weren't just real, they were intelligent, organized, and apparently immortal. More terrifying still, the government had tried to use them as weapons and failed catastrophically. The general store held more pieces of the puzzle, each one adding to David's growing sense of dread. Shelves stretched 15 feet toward the ceiling, stocked with canned goods sized for enormous appetites. Industrial-sized containers of food that would feed a normal family for months sat gathering dust, their labels faded, but still legible. Behind the counter, deep gouges scarred the wooden floor in parallel lines, as if something with massive claws had dragged its feet across the planks while pacing back and forth. The cash register sat like a small altar, its keys worn smooth by hands the size of dinner plates. The brass surface was dented and scarred, and when David examined it more closely, he found what appeared to be bite marks around the edges, deep impressions left by teeth large enough to crush a human skull. In the store's back room, David found shipping records that defied rational explanation. Orders for food quantities that could feed a small army, but delivered to a town with an official population of 47. Medical supplies included bandages 6 feet long and surgical instruments that looked more like medieval torture devices than modern tools. Most disturbing were the meat orders. Thousands of pounds of beef, pork, and poultry delivered weekly to a community that should have needed a fraction of that amount. But it was the final entry in the ledger that made David's blood run cold. Special order for Dr. Thorne. £50, fresh human tissue for research purposes, delivered to basement laboratory as requested. Payment authorised under Project Nimrod funding. The basement of St. Bartholomew's Church held the answers David had been seeking, though finding them required him to navigate through a partially collapsed structure that groaned ominously with every step. The wooden church had been beautiful once, its steeple reaching toward heaven like a prayer made manifest. Now it lay broken in the street, crushed by something with enough force to snap timbers thick as telephone poles. The stone foundation remained intact, and David descended narrow stairs into a space that reeked of age, decay, and something else that made his stomach turn. The sweet, cloying smell of old death that had soaked into the very stones. Emergency lighting from his equipment cast dancing shadows on walls that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture and time, were the handwritten journals of Dr. Edmund Thorne. The anthropologist's careful script filled hundreds of pages with observations that read like dispatches from a nightmare, chronicling months of research into beings that challenged every assumption about human evolution and natural history. Day 47 of my residency in Bromach Hollow, one entry began, the handwriting steady, despite the disturbing content. The subjects continue to demonstrate intelligence far beyond my initial assessments. They maintain complex social structures based on age, size, and hunting prowess. Most remarkable is their apparent connection to biblical accounts of the Anakim, giants mentioned in the Old Testament who supposedly survived the Great Flood and established hidden kingdoms in the wilderness. Thorne's research painted a picture of creatures that had existed in secret for millennia, breeding in isolated colonies far from human civilization, while maintaining just enough contact to feed their insatiable hunger for human flesh. They were the descendants of something far older than recorded history, predators that had once walked openly among mankind, before being driven into the wilderness by Bronze Age heroes whose names had become legend. The largest specimen, whom the others clearly regard as their chieftain, stands nearly 16 feet in height and appears to be several centuries old, Thorne wrote in an entry that made David's hands tremble. Carbon dating of shed skin and bone fragments suggests an age of at least 400 years, though this may be conservative. They appear capable of entering states of hibernation, lasting decades, emerging only when food becomes scarce or their territory is threatened by outside forces. The journal entries grew increasingly detailed and disturbing as Thorne's research progressed. He described mating rituals that involved ritualized combat and the consumption of defeated rivals, hunting strategies that demonstrated tactical planning and coordination across vast distances. Most chilling was his documentation of their feeding habits, which involved keeping human prey alive for weeks to ensure maximum freshness of the meat. Subject Alpha 1 demonstrated remarkable intelligence today by constructing a primitive snare from metal wire and positioning it along a known human travel route, one entry noted. When the trap was triggered by a local prospector, the subject did not immediately kill its prey. Instead, it disabled the man's legs and transported him to what appears to be a communal feeding chamber. The victim remained conscious and aware for approximately 6 days while various subjects fed from his extremities, suggesting they have developed techniques to prolong the feeding process while maintaining the meat's quality. But it was the journal's final entries that revealed the true scope of the horror Thorne had uncovered, and why the government had been so desperate to weaponize these creatures. The giants weren't just predators. They were capable of rapid reproduction, and possessed an instinctive understanding of human behaviour that made them perfect hunters. The subjects have become aware of our true purpose here, Thorne wrote in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic. They understand that we are studying them not for pure scientific knowledge, but to find ways to control and use them. Their reaction has been swift and terrifying. 3 researchers vanished last night: Jenkins, Morrison, and Dr. Hayes. We found pieces of Hayes in the main laboratory this morning, arranged in a pattern that suggests ritual significance. The subjects are not just killing us, they are sending a message. The final entry was barely legible, scrawled in what appeared to be blood rather than ink. They're in the facility. God help us, they're inside the walls. We thought we were studying them, but they were studying us. Learning our weaknesses, our fears, our desperation. Colonel Klein has ordered full evacuation and termination of the project, but I fear it's too late. They know about the outside world now. They know there are cities full of prey just waiting to be harvested. If anyone finds this journal, know that we failed. We opened a door that should have stayed closed forever. David photographed every page, understanding now why his grandfather had spent his final years living in fear. The giants weren't just real, they were intelligent, patient, and utterly ruthless. More terrifying still, they had been studying human civilization for decades, learning its weaknesses and preparing for something that would make the horrors of Bromach Hollow seem like a preview of far worse things to come. As evening approached, David set up his surveillance equipment in the forest surrounding the town, positioning cameras and sensors in a network that would detect movement throughout the entire valley. His infrared cameras would capture heat signatures invisible to the naked eye, while seismic sensors buried in the frozen ground would register movement too heavy for normal wildlife. He established his observation post in an abandoned cabin on the town's outskirts, a structure that commanded clear sightlines to his monitoring equipment while providing defensive advantages he hoped he wouldn't need. The cabin had belonged to someone named Fletcher, according to mail scattered across the floor, and like everything else in Bromach Hollow, it had been built for occupants of enormous size. David had to use furniture to reach light switches, positioned 10 feet off the ground, and the doors were so massive he needed both hands to open them. The windows were reinforced with steel bars that looked like they'd been designed to keep something in, rather than keep intruders out, and the walls were covered with scratches that spoke of desperate attempts to claw through solid wood. As midnight approached, David reviewed the footage his cameras had captured during the day, looking for any sign of movement in the abandoned town. For hours, nothing stirred except wind-blown snow and the occasional piece of debris tumbling down empty streets. Then, at 11:23 p.m., his equipment registered something that made his heart skip several beats. A heat signature appeared at the edge of camera range, massive, bipedal, and moving with purposeful intent toward the town centre. The shape was human in basic configuration, but scaled up beyond any reasonable proportion, and its movement pattern suggested intelligence and caution rather than the random wandering of an animal. David switched to his night vision scope and peered through the cabin's reinforced window, adjusting the focus until the forest beyond came into sharp relief. What emerged from the tree line would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life, however long that might be. Standing nearly 14 feet tall among the towering pines, the creature possessed a form that had once been human, but had evolved into something far more terrifying through centuries of adaptation to a predatory lifestyle. Its pale skin hung loose over a frame of jutting bones and oversized joints, creating the impression of a scarecrow constructed from the nightmares of madmen. The giant's proportions defied natural law. Its limbs were disproportionately long, with arms that hung past its knees and fingers that could span a man's torso, legs bent at angles that allowed impossible mobility through rough terrain, jointed in ways that suggested bones had been broken and healed multiple times to achieve maximum efficiency. Most disturbing was its torso, which seemed to have been stretched like taffy, creating space for additional organs that no human anatomy should possess. Extra ribs were clearly visible beneath stretched flesh, forming a cage that extended far below where it should end, and suggesting internal modifications that spoke of evolutionary adaptation to a carnivorous diet. When the creature breathed, David could see additional lung capacity working in rhythms that didn't match human respiration patterns. But it was the giant's head that truly marked it as something beyond human classification. The skull was proportionally larger than a normal person's, but elongated in ways that suggested additional brain capacity dedicated to hunting and spatial reasoning. Most disturbing were its eyes, milky white and filmed over, with cataracts that spoke of centuries spent in underground darkness, yet they tracked movement with predatory precision that indicated other senses had evolved to compensate for visual limitations. When the creature opened its mouth to taste the air, David saw teeth that had been deliberately modified through filing and sharpening into instruments of predation. Each tooth was at least twice the size of a human equivalent, and they were stained with substances that suggested a diet consisting primarily of raw meat and bone marrow. The giant moved through the forest with a grace that belied its enormous size, navigating between trees and over fallen logs with the fluid precision of a natural predator. Its massive feet made almost no sound on the frozen ground, and its movements suggested familiarity with this terrain that could only come from decades or centuries of residence. David watched in horrified fascination as the creature approached a bull moose that had been foraging near the town's edge. The animal was massive by any normal standard, nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing close to 1,500 pounds. Beside the giant, it looked like a household pet. The moose never had a chance to run. With casual, almost absent-minded strength, the giant reached down and grasped the animal around the neck. A single twist snapped the moose's spine with a sound like breaking timber, killing it instantly. Then, demonstrating strength that defied physics, the creature lifted the massive carcass with one hand and began dragging it deeper into the forest. David's camera captured everything in horrible detail. The ease with which the giant handled a weight that would challenge a forklift, the way it moved through thick pine trees like they were saplings, bending and breaking branches that would stop a truck. Most disturbing was the intelligence evident in its actions. This wasn't random predation, but purposeful hunting, with the carcass being transported to a specific location for processing. As the giant disappeared into the darkness, David realized his situation had become far more dangerous than he had anticipated. The creature's route through the forest had taken it directly past 2 of his hidden cameras, and if it possessed the intelligence Thorne had documented, it would know it was being watched. More troubling was the realization that this was likely just one of many. Thorne's research had indicated a breeding population of at least a dozen adults, and if they had been reproducing for the past 80 years, their numbers could have grown significantly. Dawn brought confirmation of David's worst fears and revealed the true scope of what he was facing. During his morning equipment check, he discovered that his carefully positioned cameras had been systematically destroyed during the night, not damaged by weather or knocked down by animals, but deliberately targeted by something with incredible strength and apparent understanding of their purpose. The first camera had been pulverized so completely that only fragments of metal and plastic remained scattered in the snow like confetti. The destruction was surgical in its precision. Every component had been crushed individually, as if the giant had taken time to examine each piece before methodically destroying it. The second camera had been twisted into an unrecognizable sculpture of bent metal and shattered glass, its housing compressed as if squeezed by hands, capable of generating thousands of pounds of pressure. Fragments of the device were embedded in nearby trees driven into solid wood, with enough force to penetrate several inches. The third camera was missing entirely, torn from its mounting with such violence the bark had been stripped from the surrounding pines in long spirals that suggested claws the size of railroad spikes. The mounting bracket, designed to withstand hurricane-force winds, had been snapped like a toothpick, but it was the tracks David found that truly revealed the intelligence he was dealing with. Footprints nearly 3 feet long and pressed deep into the frozen ground formed a complete perimeter around his observation point, documenting hours of surveillance by creatures that had studied his defenses while he slept. Each footprint told a story of incredible weight and deliberate movement. The depth of impression suggested beings weighing well over 1,000 pounds, yet the spacing between steps indicated they could move with surprising stealth when necessary. David found places where they had stopped to examine his equipment, their massive hands leaving impressions in the metal housing of his sensors. Most disturbing were the marks around the cabin itself. Deep gouges in the wooden walls showed where claws had tested the structure's strength, while scratches around the windows suggested they had been examining possible entry points. The giants had spent the night learning everything they could about their unwelcome visitor, preparing for what would come next. As the second night fell over Bromach Hollow, the true hunt began, and David discovered just how thoroughly he had underestimated his adversaries. The attack started as a deep, rhythmic throbbing that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, a frequency so low it bypassed David's ears entirely and struck directly at his nervous system. Within minutes, nausea and disorientation set in, followed by a crushing sense of dread that had no rational source but felt like the weight of the world pressing down on his chest. David recognized the phenomenon from his military training as infrasound. Frequencies below the range of human hearing that could cause panic, nausea, and disorientation in exposed subjects. Elephants use similar techniques to coordinate herd movements across vast distances, while tigers employed infrasound to paralyze prey before attacking. The giants were using it as a hunting tool, softening their prey psychologically before moving in for the kill. The attack was coordinated and precise, with different frequencies targeting different aspects of human physiology. Low-end pulses caused nausea and vertigo, while higher frequencies within the infrasonic range induced panic responses and disrupted cognitive function. David found himself struggling to think clearly, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the sonic device he'd built from radio components and medical equipment. By generating counter-frequencies tuned to oppose the giants' infrasonic assault, David managed to partially block their psychological warfare, though the effort left him exhausted and shaking. The device worked by creating interference patterns that cancelled out the harmful frequencies, but maintaining the effect required constant adjustment as the giants modified their attack patterns. Through his night vision scope, David caught glimpses of movement in the forest that defied belief. Massive shapes flitted between the trees, with impossible stealth, their size making their silence all the more unnerving. They moved in coordinated patterns that spoke of tactical planning and centuries of experience hunting prey that could think and adapt. The giants were communicating through subsonic calls that made David's equipment scream with feedback whenever he tried to record them. The sounds carried information about positioning, target status, and tactical adjustments, creating a real-time battlefield management system that would have impressed modern military strategists. As the night progressed, David realized the giants had left evidence of their hunting methods scattered throughout the forest. Like a museum of predation, nets woven from animal sinew and tree bark hung between the pines, each one large enough to snare a small aircraft and strong enough to hold a struggling elephant. The construction was sophisticated, with tension systems that would tighten automatically when prey became entangled. Clubs fashioned from entire tree trunks lay propped against boulders, their surfaces stained dark with old blood and scored with tooth marks from previous kills. Each weapon was balanced for maximum impact, with grips carved to accommodate hands larger than dinner plates. The wood showed signs of repeated use, polished smooth by decades of contact with giant palms. Most unsettling were the hooks, dozens of them carved from what appeared to be whale bone and driven into tree trunks at strategic locations throughout the forest. David realized they formed a network designed to guide prey towards specific killing grounds, funneling victims into areas where escape would be impossible and resistance futile. The system was sophisticated beyond anything he'd expected, demonstrating planning, engineering capability, and tactical thinking that spoke of intelligence far beyond simple predatory instinct. The giants had turned the entire forest into a trap, with Bromach Hollow serving as bait to draw in curious investigators and unwary travellers. But as the night wore on, David began to understand the true scope of their strategy. The giants weren't just hunting him. They were herding him, using coordinated movements and psychological pressure to drive him towards a specific location. Every escape route he attempted was blocked by infrasonic bursts that sent him stumbling in the opposite direction, while massive shapes materialized from the darkness whenever he tried to circle back to his truck. By dawn, David found himself exactly where the giants wanted him, trapped in the abandoned power station that had once supplied electricity to the mining operation. The building's concrete walls provided some protection from the infrasonic assault, and its elevated position offered tactical advantages he would desperately need for what was coming. The power station was a monument to industrial ambition, built in the 1920s to support mining operations that were supposed to make Bromach Hollow rich. Instead, it had become a tomb for human dreams and the launching point for nightmares that had been sleeping in the deep places of the earth. While barricading the station's entrances with furniture and debris, David made a crucial discovery that would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. Hidden in Dr. Thorne's research notes was a detailed analysis of giant anatomy, including measurements and observations that revealed a critical vulnerability in their otherwise perfect predatory design. Despite their massive size and incredible strength, the giants possessed one significant weakness that evolution had failed to address. Their heads, while proportionally larger than a human's, hadn't developed the bone density needed to protect their oversized brains. The skull thickness remained consistent with baseline human norms, creating a vulnerability that could be exploited with sufficient force and precision. David's grandfather's journal confirmed this analysis with technical data from Project Nimrod that read like a blueprint for giant anatomy. Government researchers had conducted detailed studies mapping every aspect of giant physiology for potential military applications. The cranial measurements were particularly thorough, noting that while giant brains were significantly larger than human equivalents, their protective bone casing represented a critical scaling failure in their evolutionary development. Subject Alpha 1 demonstrates cranial capacity approximately 2.3 times baseline human norms, one report noted. However, skull thickness averages only 0.8 millimeters greater than human standard, representing a critical vulnerability to kinetic trauma. Recommend development of specialized ammunition for potential future engagements. Using his military engineering background and the power station's abandoned equipment, David began constructing a weapon that would give him a fighting chance against creatures that had been perfecting their predatory skills for centuries. He dismantled copper coils from massive transformers, salvaged capacitors from control panels, and rewired electrical systems to create an electromagnetic railgun capable of accelerating projectiles to velocities that would make conventional firearms seem like toys. The weapon was a modern interpretation of David's biblical slingshot, using electromagnetic fields instead of centrifugal force to generate kinetic energy. Tungsten ball bearings salvaged from the station's machinery would serve as ammunition. At the velocities David's railgun could achieve, the projectiles would carry enough energy to penetrate armor plating, let alone the relatively thin bone of a giant skull. The construction process took most of the day, with David working feverishly, while the giants tested his defenses with increasingly aggressive probes. He could hear them moving around the power station, their massive footsteps causing vibrations that shook dust from the concrete ceiling. Occasionally, one would scrape its claws against the outer walls, producing a sound like nails on a chalkboard that made David's teeth ache. While assembling his weapon, David studied every page of his grandfather's documentation, looking for any advantage that might tip the scales in his favor. The giants maintained a strict hierarchical structure based on age, size, and hunting prowess, with the largest male serving as chieftain and tactical coordinator for the group. Thorne's research suggested that killing the chieftain would trigger a biological survival mechanism in the surviving giants, causing them to retreat into deep hibernation for potentially decades. It was an evolutionary adaptation designed to preserve the species during times of extreme danger, activated by the loss of their leader and the implied threat to their continued existence. David also prepared contingency measures using industrial explosives he'd found scattered throughout the power station's storage facilities. Mining operations had required massive amounts of dynamite to blast through solid rock, and decades of abandonment had left crates of the volatile material scattered throughout the complex like deadly Easter eggs waiting to be found. The dynamite was old but still functional, its nitroglycerin content stabilized by sawdust and clay in a formula that had changed little since the early 1900s. David carefully redistributed the explosive charges throughout the power station and the connecting tunnels that led to the mining complex, creating a network that could bring down the entire facility if his primary plan failed. It was a last resort born of desperation and the growing certainty that he was facing something far more dangerous than even his grandfather's warnings had suggested. If the giants broke through his defenses, David would ensure they paid the ultimate price for their victory, even if it meant his own death in the process. As his third night in Bromach Hollow approached, David knew he couldn't remain on the defensive any longer. The giants had grown increasingly bold throughout the day, testing his barricades with coordinated assaults that came closer to success each time. Their intelligence was evident in how they adapted their tactics, learning from each failed attempt and adjusting their approach accordingly. More troubling was what David had observed through his remaining surveillance equipment. The giants weren't just hunting him, they were preparing for something larger. Throughout the day, he'd detected movement patterns that suggested they were positioning themselves for a coordinated assault on multiple fronts, using tactics that would have impressed military strategists. The realization that came to David as darkness fell was both terrifying and oddly liberating. He wasn't going to escape Bromach Hollow alive unless he took the fight to them first. The giants had every advantage: numbers, size, strength, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and centuries of experience hunting human prey. His only chance was to do something they wouldn't expect: attack their stronghold directly and eliminate their leadership before they could bring their full strength to bear. Following tracks that led from the power station towards the mountain's heart, David ventured into the mining complex, where the giants had established their primary lair. The entrance was a gaping wound in the mountainside, surrounded by equipment that had been abandoned so quickly the operators hadn't bothered to shut down their machinery. Rusted vehicles sat where they'd been left 80 years ago, their metal surfaces corroded by decades of weather but still bearing the scars of claw marks that told of desperate final moments. The tunnels beyond were a maze of passages, carved from solid rock, some dating back to the original 1896 excavation, others clearly excavated by the giants themselves over the intervening decades. The walls showed different construction techniques: human-carved sections with tool marks and blast patterns, versus giant excavated areas where the stone had been clawed and chewed away by something with incredible patience and determination. Evidence of the giant's presence filled every chamber David explored, creating a museum of predation that documented centuries of hunting success. Human bones, picked clean and arranged in neat piles, lined the walls like grisly decorations. The arrangement wasn't random. David recognized organizational patterns that suggested the giants categorized their kills by age, size, and possibly even nutritional content. Crude cave paintings covered every flat surface, depicting hunting scenes and ritual gatherings, painted in pigments that analysis would probably reveal to be mixtures of blood, clay, and ground bone. The artwork was surprisingly sophisticated, showing tactical hunting formations, seasonal migration patterns of prey animals, and what appeared to be maps of human settlements throughout the region. Most disturbing were the paintings that showed giants interacting with human figures in ways that suggested more than simple predation. Some depicted what appeared to be trade relationships, with humans offering tribute in exchange for protection. Others showed hybrid offspring, creatures that possessed characteristics of both species in combinations that violated every law of genetics David understood. Areas where the rock had been worn smooth by the passage of enormous bodies created highways that connected different sections of the complex, forming a transportation network that extended far deeper into the mountain than the original mining operations had ever reached. The smoothness of these passages spoke of centuries of use, with the stone polished to an almost mirror finish by contact with giant bodies. The tunnels descended far deeper than David had expected, branching into a network that must have taken generations to excavate. The air grew thicker as he progressed, heavy with moisture and the accumulated exhalations of creatures that had been breathing in these confined spaces for decades. Strange acoustics carried sounds from impossible distances. The drip of water from chambers miles away, the scrape of claws on stone from passages that branched beyond his sight, and underneath it all, a rhythmic breathing that suggested something enormous was sleeping in the darkness ahead. The smell grew stronger as David descended, evolving from the simple mustiness of underground spaces into something far more disturbing. The air carried the scent of carnivorous creatures that had never known sunlight, mixed with the sweet corruption of old death and something else that made his stomach turn. The distinctive smell of fresh human meat being processed for consumption. 3 hours into his descent, following a main passage that had been carved with precision tools and engineering skill that exceeded anything the original miners had possessed, David discovered the giant's primary nesting chamber. The space that opened before him was so vast his flashlight couldn't illuminate the far walls, a natural cathedral that had been expanded and modified over centuries into something that served purposes beyond simple shelter. The chamber floor was carpeted with bones representing generations of predation, a killing field that stretched back to the town's founding and beyond. Skulls from the 1800s sat beside more recent kills, creating a timeline of death that documented every person who had ever ventured too close to Bromach Hollow. David recognized some of the more recent remains: hiking gear from the 1990s, the uniform of a park ranger who had disappeared just 5 years ago, a child's backpack that made his stomach clench with rage and sorrow. But it was the organization of the remains that truly revealed the giant's intelligence and the scope of their operation. The bones weren't simply discarded after feeding. They had been sorted, catalogued, and arranged according to systems that spoke of record-keeping and planning that extended far beyond simple predatory behavior. Different sections of the chamber contained remains sorted by age, with children's bones separated from adults in a way that suggested the giants had preferences based on the tenderness and flavor of different age groups. Another area contained bones that showed evidence of specific preparation techniques, scoring, marinating, and aging processes that indicated the giants had developed sophisticated culinary practices over centuries of human consumption. Most disturbing was a section that contained bones from individuals who had clearly been kept alive for extended periods, showing evidence of systematic feeding that had removed non-vital portions while keeping the victims conscious and aware. The precision of the cuts and the evidence of healing between feeding sessions spoke of techniques designed to maximize both the quantity and quality of meat harvested from each victim. Along the chamber walls, David found what could only be described as storage areas, carved recesses where partially processed human remains were kept at optimal temperatures for aging and flavor development. The sophistication of the preservation techniques rivaled anything found in modern commercial meat processing, but adapted for a product that made David's hands shake as he documented everything with his camera. The giants had turned human predation into an art form, developing techniques and technologies that had been refined over centuries of practice. They weren't simply eating people, they were farming them, processing them, and storing them according to culinary standards that spoke of intelligence and cultural development that human science had never imagined. As David explored deeper into the chamber, his light revealed modifications that had been made to accommodate the giant's specific needs. Carved channels in the floor directed blood flow toward collection points where it could be harvested for various purposes. Stone platforms at different heights provided workspace for different stages of prey processing, with tool marks that showed where specialized implements had been used for specific cutting and preparation techniques. The walls were lined with carved recesses that held what appeared to be tools, implements crafted from human bone and metal, salvaged from their victims' possessions. Knives made from sharpened femurs, cutting boards carved from human rib cages, and storage containers fashioned from skulls created a toolkit that represented the ultimate violation of human dignity. But it was the sound that emerged from deeper in the chamber that made David's blood freeze in his veins, a rhythmic scraping that spoke of something enormous stirring in the darkness beyond his light. The giant's primary den extended far beyond what he could see, and something was awakening in response to his presence. A sound like grinding millstones echoed through the vast space as the chamber's primary occupant began to move, responding to the intrusion with the deliberate menace of something that had never known fear. What emerged from a passage on the cavern's far side was a creature from humanity's darkest nightmares. The apex predator that ruled over all the other giants and commanded their absolute obedience through a combination of size, intelligence, and ruthless cunning. The chieftain stood nearly 16 feet tall, a living monument to predation and survival that had walked the earth for centuries. Its body bore the scars of countless battles, claw marks from territorial disputes with other giants, burn scars from encounters with human technology, and ritual scarification that suggested a culture based on violence, dominance, and the systematic consumption of weaker species. Every aspect of the creature's physiology had been optimized for killing and consuming human prey. Muscles like steel cables moved beneath pale skin that had never known sunlight, while joints articulated with mechanical precision that allowed for movement patterns no human anatomy could achieve. Its hands were the size of manhole covers, with fingers that ended in claws capable of punching through automobile steel, and its feet could crush a man's torso with the casual pressure of a footstep. Most terrifying were the creature's modifications, deliberate alterations to its anatomy that spoke of surgical precision and understanding of biology that exceeded modern medical knowledge. Additional ribs had been grafted into its torso, creating space for oversized organs that could process the massive amounts of protein required to sustain its enormous frame. Its jaw had been expanded and reinforced with what appeared to be metal implants, allowing it to bite through human bone with the ease of crushing eggshells. The giant's eyes, while blind from centuries of underground existence, tracked David's movement with predatory precision that spoke of hearing sharpened to supernatural levels and spatial awareness that could map the entire chamber through sound alone. When it opened its mouth, David saw teeth that had been deliberately filed to points and reinforced with metal caps, creating a set of dental tools perfectly designed for tearing flesh from bone and crushing human skulls for access to the brain tissue within. But it was the intelligence in the creature's movements that truly made David understand the scope of what he was facing. This wasn't a mindless predator driven by simple hunger. It was a thinking being with centuries of experience hunting the most dangerous prey on Earth. A strategic mind that had survived and thrived by understanding human psychology better than most humans understood themselves. The chieftain began moving toward David with deliberate slowness, savoring the hunt after decades of hibernation. Each footstep created tremors that brought sections of ceiling raining down in cascades of stone and dust, while its breath formed clouds of vapor that carried the stench of 1,000 kills and the promise of deaths yet to come. David could hear other giants stirring in the passages beyond, responding to their leader's awakening with sounds that spoke of hunger, anticipation, and the prospect of feeding on fresh human meat after years of preserved rations. The entire chamber was coming alive around him, filled with creatures that had been waiting for exactly this moment, the arrival of prey foolish enough to enter their domain voluntarily. Positioning himself behind a formation of stalagmites that would provide both cover and a stable firing platform, David activated his electromagnetic railgun and felt the weapon's capacitors building charge with a high-pitched whine that seemed to cut through the chamber's oppressive atmosphere. The targeting system he'd improvised from laser components painted a red dot on the chieftain's forehead, marking the exact point where his tungsten projectile would need to strike to penetrate the creature's skull and reach its brain. The cavern's acoustics would work in his favor, bouncing sound waves in patterns that would make it difficult for the giant to pinpoint his exact location until the moment of attack. David had one chance to end this confrontation. If he missed, or if his improvised weapon failed to deliver sufficient kinetic energy, the chieftain would rip him apart with the casual efficiency of something that had been perfecting the art of human destruction for centuries. As the giant closed to within 30 feet, moving with the patient confidence of something that had never encountered prey capable of meaningful resistance, David stepped into the open and raised his electromagnetic weapon. The targeting laser painted its red dot directly between the creature's blind eyes, marking the point where human ingenuity would either triumph over primordial terror or fail catastrophically. The chieftain's massive head turned toward the sound of David's movement, blind eyes focusing with inhuman intensity on a threat it couldn't quite comprehend. For a moment that stretched toward eternity, predator and prey regarded each other across the vast chamber, the descendant of biblical giants that had terrorized humanity for millennia, and a single human being armed with nothing but determination, engineering skill, and the desperate hope that David's ancient victory could be repeated in the modern world. The giant's mouth opened in what might have been a roar or a laugh, revealing the full horror of its dental modifications and filling the chamber with a sound that spoke of hunger, malevolence, and absolute confidence in its ability to add another set of human bones to its collection. Then it charged with speed that defied its enormous size, covering the distance in heartbeats while its massive hands reached out to crush David like an insect. David fired his railgun at point-blank range, the electromagnetic coils discharging their stored energy in a fraction of a second and accelerating the tungsten projectile to nearly 3 times the speed of sound. The bearing struck the giant directly in the center of its forehead, punching through bone that had been thickened by centuries of combat but had never evolved the density needed to stop a hypersonic projectile. The kinetic energy transfer was catastrophic and instantaneous. The tungsten bearing penetrated the chieftain's skull and continued through brain tissue, creating a wound channel that destroyed critical neural pathways and severed connections that had controlled the creature's motor functions for centuries. The impact was so sudden and complete that the giant's nervous system never had time to register what had happened. The creature's forward momentum carried it several more steps before its brain caught up with the reality of its destruction. Then it toppled backward like a felled redwood, crashing into the cavern floor with a sound that shook the entire mountain and sent shockwaves through the network of passages that honeycombed the underground complex. Immediately, answering calls echoed through the tunnel system as other giants throughout the complex responded to their chieftain's death. The sounds were unlike anything human ears were meant to hear, a mixture of rage, grief, and primitive communication that spoke of intelligence David had hoped they didn't possess. But there was something else in those calls, something that gave him hope, confusion and fear, emotions that suggested the loss of their leader had triggered exactly the biological response Thorne's research had predicted. Heavy footsteps thundered through connecting passages as the survivors began converging on the nesting chamber, but their movement patterns were erratic, disorganized, lacking the tactical coordination David had observed earlier. The chieftain's death had severed the command structure that held their society together, leaving them rudderless and increasingly desperate. David counted at least 6 distinct sets of footfalls, each representing a creature capable of tearing him limb from limb if it reached him. His railgun was a single-shot weapon that would take precious minutes to recharge, time he didn't have with angry giants closing in from multiple directions. The explosive charges he'd positioned throughout the complex represented his only chance of survival, but triggering them would mean bringing down the entire mountain on both himself and his enemies. As the first of the surviving giants appeared in the chamber entrance, a female nearly as large as the chieftain, her scarred hide telling stories of decades spent perfecting the art of human predation. David activated the detonation sequence he'd wired throughout the mining complex. The explosion that followed was beyond anything David had experienced, even during his military service in combat zones where high explosives were part of daily life. 80 years' worth of mining dynamite detonated simultaneously throughout the tunnel network, creating a chain reaction that turned the entire mountain into a percussion instrument played by the gods of destruction. The blast wave pursued David through the winding passages as he ran for his life, carrying the screams of giants caught in collapsing tunnels and the grinding roar of millions of tons of rock settling into new configurations. The mountain shook itself apart from within, sealing chambers that had witnessed centuries of horror and burying secrets that the world was probably better off never knowing. David barely escaped through a maintenance shaft that connected to the original mining complex, emerging into daylight as the mountainside above him collapsed in a controlled avalanche that would reshape the local geography for generations to come. Behind him, the entrance to the giant's domain disappeared beneath hundreds of feet of rubble, entombing whatever survivors remained in a prison of stone that would take centuries to excavate. As dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to celebrate his victory, David stood among the ruins of Bromach Hollow and felt something he hadn't experienced since receiving his grandfather's final letter: hope. The town stretched below him, silent now that the creatures haunting its streets had been entombed beneath the mountain, their reign of terror finally ended by a descendant of the shepherd boy who had faced down giants in ancient times. But David's celebration was short-lived, cut off by a discovery that changed everything he thought he understood about his victory and the scope of the threat he'd been fighting. While collecting evidence from the ruins, fragments of giant bone, pages from Thorne's research journals, and his video recordings of the encounters, David's radio equipment detected transmissions that made his blood run cold. The signals weren't coming from the collapsed mountain or the abandoned town. They were broadcasting from dozens of locations across Alaska and northern Canada, a network of transmission points that suggested a threat far larger than anything his grandfather's generation had imagined. The biblical giants hadn't been limited to a single settlement in an abandoned mining town. They had established colonies throughout the Arctic wilderness, breeding and expanding for decades while the world remained ignorant of their existence. David's victory at Bromach Hollow had been significant but limited in scope. He had eliminated one family group, possibly one of the smaller ones based on the transmission patterns his equipment was detecting. The radio chatter suggested communication between settlements, coordination on a scale that implied a civilization rather than scattered groups of predators. As he loaded his truck for the journey back to what he'd thought of as safety, David realized that his grandfather's final warning had been incomplete. The old soldier had known about Bromach Hollow because he'd been part of the team that had tried to contain the threat in 1943, but the scope of that threat had been far larger than anyone in the government had realized. The giants hadn't been driven to the brink of extinction by Bronze Age heroes as the biblical accounts suggested. They had simply learned to be more careful, establishing hidden settlements in the most remote areas of the world where human contact would be minimal and discovery unlikely. For centuries, they had been breeding, learning, and preparing for something that David's victory had only postponed. His radio crackled with transmissions in the ancient language he'd heard on his first night in Bromach Hollow, but now he could make out the individual words and phrases that roughly translated to preparations for migration, discussions of new hunting grounds, and most terrifyingly, references to the awakening and the gathering of the tribes. David's destruction of the Bromach Hollow giants had sent a signal throughout their hidden civilization, alerting other settlements that human technology had evolved to pose a genuine threat to their existence. The response was swift and coordinated. Giants throughout to the Arctic were abandoning their traditional territories and moving toward more populated areas, where they could find both easier prey and better concealment among human populations. As David's truck disappeared down the mountain road, leaving the silence of Bromach Hollow behind him, his radio filled with reports that would soon dominate emergency broadcasts across the region. Hikers had vanished from Denali National Park under circumstances that defied rational explanation, leaving behind campsites that looked like they'd been hit by natural disasters. An entire research station in the Yukon had gone silent overnight, with rescue teams finding only scattered equipment and footprints, too large to belong to any known animal. In the weeks that followed, similar disappearances would be reported from remote areas across Alaska, northern Canada, and the northernmost regions of Siberia. Search and rescue teams would find evidence of predation on a scale that wildlife experts couldn't explain. Entire hiking groups consumed down to the bone, research facilities stripped of personnel with surgical precision, and isolated communities that simply vanished, as if they had never existed. David Klein had won the battle at Bromach Hollow, proving that the descendants of Goliath could be defeated by human courage and ingenuity, just as they had been in ancient times. But in doing so, he had awakened something far larger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. A hidden civilization of predators that had been content to remain in the shadows until one small-town military engineer had forced them into the light. The war between David and the giants had only begun, and the darkness held secrets that would test every skill he'd learned as both soldier and engineer. But for the first time since receiving his grandfather's final letter, David felt something approaching purpose. He had seen the enemy, understood their capabilities, and proven they could be beaten. Whatever came next, he would be ready. The radio crackled again with signals from the deep wilderness, where ancient things were learning to adapt to a modern world that no longer believed in monsters. David adjusted the frequency, noted the coordinates, and drove toward an uncertain future where his next battle was already being planned by creatures that had survived since the dawn of human civilization. Behind him, Bromach Hollow settled into its eternal winter silence, but the tremors he'd felt during his escape told a different story. Deep beneath the collapsed mountain, in chambers the explosives hadn't reached, something was still moving. The giants were patient creatures, and they had learned to wait. The war was far from over, and David Klein had become humanity's unlikely champion in a conflict that most people would never know existed. In the distance, his radio picked up emergency broadcasts reporting strange disappearances across the Northern Territories, each one a piece in a puzzle that painted a picture of an ancient enemy adapting to hunt in a modern world. The descendants of Goliath were no longer content to hide in the wilderness, and David's victory had taught them that humanity had evolved beyond the Bronze Age shepherds they remembered. The giants were learning, adapting, and preparing for a war that would determine whether humanity would continue to rule the earth or become livestock for creatures that had been perfecting the art of predation since before recorded history began. David drove south through the wilderness, his truck loaded with evidence that the world would struggle to believe, and weapons, he hoped, would be enough for the battles ahead. In his rearview mirror, the mountains of Alaska held secrets that would haunt his dreams, but ahead lay a future where ancient enemies would learn that the spirit of David lived on in those brave enough to face giants, whatever the cost. The real war was just beginning.